Hello again, I'm Candace Savanen, your main instructor for this course. Let's dive into some GitHub Action fundamentals. This is the licensing information for this course. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to demonstrate how to understand the basics of a GitHub Action structure, recognize computing environments as a key tool of reproducibility and automation. We're going to navigate to GitHub to find details on a GitHub Actions run. We're going to run in already created GitHub Actions for us, and then look up the details for a GitHub Actions run. Let's dive in then. Okay, so there are a lot of different things that you can set up with a GitHub Action, but these are the three things that we're going to need to space. These are the three things that we're going to need to space. These are the three things that we're going to need to pay special attention to that are definitely required for us to set. So those three things are: when do we want this GitHub Action to occur? So what do we want it? What kind of event is going to happen? Is it a regular time that we want it to just run every so often? Just kind of what's going to precipitate this GitHub Action to trigger it to run? What is going to actually happen when this GitHub Action runs? And then with what? So, and that just kind of means like what computing environment. So what software needs to be in here? Are we going to run it on a Ubuntu operating system? Are we going to run it on a Mac OS operating system? That's all up to us, and we need to tell GitHub to do that. How do we specify all that? We do that with a YAML file. Here's an example of a YAML file with the most basic GitHub action we could. This is the entirety of a GitHub action. It's very simple GitHub action, but we'll walk through this here. So about working with YAML files, everything is a list, kind of like a JSON file in that everything's a list. And we can have subsets of lists within lists, okay? And those indentations then are how we create subsets of lists. So on the right here, we see an example. We can notice that we can comment on our YAML files using hashtags or pound signs, whatever you're calling those. And then here we have a list of food, for example, and we have two major subsets, which are vegetables and fruits. And underneath those, we have some lists in there. So vegetables, we just have tomatoes as an item, but then under the fruits, we have subsets of fruits, which is citrus and tropical, and under each of those. But you can imagine we could add a lot more to this list and keep building it. But here's the thing you need to know is that with YAML files, spacing is very specific. If you have even just one space wrong, or an extra space where it's not supposed to be, or you need more spaces where they're supposed to be, your GitHub action will not run and you will find an error. We will go through what this looks like when your spacing is not right, but basically you need to have two spaces or an indent or a tab for every time you are trying to make a subset of a list, and it's going to look for that. So basics of a GitHub action then. So there's the on part of the GitHub action. That's the when should this run? And then there's the jobs part of the action. That's the what should actually run. Now, to get our GitHub actions to actually work and to be recognized by GitHub, it's all about the location. We have to have them in the exact right file path, and here's the right file path. You have to make folders that they're not going to exist by default in your repository, but in your repository, you have to make a dot, don't forget the dot, GitHub. That's your first folder you're going to make. And then within that, you're going to make a folder called workflows. Now, I have so many times created a folder called workflow, singular. That does not work. It has to be .github and then subset of folder workflows. And then within there, you make your YAML file. That actually is your GitHub action. And you can name that whatever you want. So the when, that's the on part of the GitHub action. That's, how do we want this to be triggered to be run? And this is where, to me, this is what really inspires new GitHub actions. Okay, we can think about what can trigger an action. So workflow dispatch, for example, is just like nothing is going to actually trigger it except for you. You are going to go in to GitHub and you're going to click a button and then it's going to trigger it. Okay, there's other ways we could trigger actions because obviously we want to automate things. So we probably wouldn't want to actually go click a button to do stuff. Instead, we could do it by a schedule. So maybe we want it to run 5 p.m. Eastern time every day or something. We could set that up. We could have it run by a pull request. This is actually, to me, one of the more common uses for automation with GitHub Actions is a pull request, because as we're integrating changes, for us to set up that continuous integration, continuous deployment setup, we're going to want it to run a particular action to do unit testing, or rerunning the analysis to see if the changes that we're suggesting to be made to the code actually do any kind of changes to the results, or especially we want to know if an error is now introduced. So pull request trigger is really common and really great. We're going to use that a lot later on. But there's other ways we could trigger things that are handy for managing our own workflows in GitHub. So we can have it triggered by a push. So anytime a branch is pushed or merged into something, we could specify, and each of these things have also sub options we can specify to really tailor and hone in of when we want something to run. We can, when something happens to an issue, this could be creating an issue, closing an issue, tagging an issue. There's, again, a lot of subsets for each of these things. And workflow calls, that means that we might have a GitHub action that calls another GitHub action. All right, then we're getting really complex here. Pull request review comments. Again, these are all just a sampling of what's on GitHub Actions, what's available right now. So I strongly encourage you to look at the GitHub Action documentation in order to find out more details about any of these options. But certainly don't feel the need to do that right now, because we're going to go a little bit more into the fundamentals. But that will be a great resource for you moving forward from this course, that you'll want to dive into the documentation to figure out how to use these different triggers. All right, the what of the GitHub action is the jobs. So what do we want to actually be run when we do have the trigger triggered? Okay, when the on is triggered, what do we want to actually happen? And that's underneath the jobs part of this. And what can you do? There's so many things you could do. This is even just a small subset of a thing that you could see. So there's a lot of examples online, so you can look at the awesome actions. They have a whole listing there. There's just, GitHub Actions Marketplace has all kinds of already pre-made GitHub Actions, so you don't have to write all this code to do all this stuff. You can go find code that other people have written and published in a published GitHub Actions that you can just use that. So what could you do? Here's just a few examples. You could style code, you could spell check, you could re-render files, you could rerun an analysis, which we're going to do. You could run tests on code, you could push a release, you could put comments on it. Say you have contributors, you want them to know about something automatically. You could send Slack messages, so you can do integrations, right? You can do integrations with other apps. Really, the possibilities are just huge. There's so many. You can run a script. You could copy files from one repository to another. So you're not necessarily even constrained to only do one repository action. You can have ones that span to different repositories. You could update a Docker image, so you could definitely work with containers. And we have our other course that goes into more about containers. Yeah, literally anything you can code, you could automate. Really, what GitHub Actions allows you to do is just have it triggered by any kind of event that you would like that's probably going to be on GitHub. So there's a lot of possibilities. So here's an example. Let's tailor down to one example. You might be running an analysis using public data that continually has more samples added, right? And then you want to make sure that as more samples are added, that the analysis can rerun, and it can rerun successfully. And you would like to be informed of when the analysis got rerun and what the results are in Slack. So that's the thing you could write. You could write a GitHub action that does that for you. And think about all the steps that are involved in that you may have done manually that now you have automated. That's pretty slick, right? So in order to do that, though, it doesn't actually take as much time as you'd think. You can borrow other people's actions from GitHub Action Marketplace, okay? I've published some on there. There's huge groups that publish these GitHub Actions and really well maintain them. A quick note, though, that you probably want to make sure that the developer that you're using is well vetted. Anybody can publish a GitHub Action Marketplace, so you're going to want to make sure that you're not just like borrowing things from somebody who might be trying to do something bad or do something that's not secure. So that's just a quick disclaimer. But if you're using ones that are from verified sources or from somebody that you know and trust, then you're all set. And that really opens up a lot of possibilities. So yes, with what? So what is running it? So in this example, you see it's running on Ubuntu latest, okay? And so what does that really mean? So we'll talk about that in a second about the computing environment. So the job name and the list steps The job name can be anything as long as it adheres to, it doesn't have spaces and stuff like that. But in this instance, we're calling the job hello. And then steps, this part is always this way. You always have to call it steps. So that way it knows to look for what we're going to be running. And then at the very bottom there is then we see what we're, for this particular example, we're just going to echo hello world. Pretty simple. We're going to start off with this, and then we can name our steps. We can also name, as you can see at the very top of this YAML, we can name our entire action, and that's how it's going to show up. So in here we have name at the very top. It's called basic GitHub action. So that's how we can do it. So about the computing environment then, why are we having to say with what? So GitHub, or Microsoft that develops and maintains GitHub, has computers everywhere doing these jobs. You're sending them these jobs through GitHub Actions, and they're running it there. Okay. And so why do we have to specify an environment is that when you run things for a GitHub action, it's going to spin up. It's going to make a fresh environment. It's going to make a blank slate, essentially. So here's the thing that you might get tripped up by, and I need you to be aware of it when you're trying to run your GitHub actions, is that you might have all kinds of software installed on your local computer, and when you run your code, it works all fine. But when you run it on GitHub actions, if you didn't install it, it won't be able to run. Okay, so this is where Docker images can really come in handy. And again, or could be Singularity or whichever container management tool of your choice. But that's where you can supply an image to it, so that way it has all the software you need. Alternatively, if you only have like one software package you need, you could also just use Ubuntu latest, install the one software package you need if it doesn't take too long to install, and go from there. So there's a lot of options, but the lesson here is that if you get an error that's like Python not found, for example, it might be because you don't have Python installed. So just keep kind of aware of that as you see errors. And we'll return to more troubleshooting tips in a later chapter. So yeah, runs on is your operating system. That could be, here's at least 3 that are maintained by GitHub. So they have these available as just, you don't have to do anything. You can just use Ubuntu, Windows, or Mac OS. Again, remember though that this will not have any other software really installed on it that you're probably going to want to use. You want to use Python, R, anything like that, it's not going to be already installed. You're going to have to install it. Or I think a better strategy is to use build a container or an image, so that way you can use that. What is a container then? Let's dive a little bit into that. This is not a strictly correct definition. This is an intuitive definition. So it's kind of like your computer is running a different computer inside of it. Okay, it's kind of acting like it's a different computer on the inside. So I can run a container on my computer, and it's going to pretend it's Ubuntu, even though my computer might be a PC or a Mac. But it's going to pretend within my computer that it's running an Ubuntu. And in that container, it's isolated from the rest of my computer. So that's a really handy tool for reproducibility, because then I know exactly what is in that computing environment, because I have a Docker file that I use to build that has all of the lists of the software that we installed to make that in computing environment. So it's pretending, it's a little bit of a disguise. It's kind of like a virtual machine, but it is not a virtual machine by the strictest computer science definitions. But that's kind of the idea, because our computers aren't blank slates, right? Like, even if you tried, you could not make 2 computers identical. It would be very hard to do that. And even if you thought you did, you might not have. And this can affect our results. In fact, we have research that shows that different kinds of package versions can affect results. So these environments, even if we tried, we can't keep them static, right? You have updates that your software, your computer wants you to install. Like, it'll prompt you, right? And sometimes it'll install it even without you knowing. So our computers are a moving target. This can be really tricky for reproducibility purposes. Here's an example in a printout of showing that, like, 2 different, on the left and on the right, we have this is called session info, printout from what an analysis might have been run with. So we might have different versions of R. We might have different operating systems. One of these was run with Ubuntu. One was run with Mac OS Big Sur. We might have different packages that are either loaded or installed and different versions of those. And that all can play into the results that we get in the end and what kind of reproducibility we have. And this is the research that shows that from the Green Lab. So if you have, for example, different versions, this is on the left, it's showing different versions and how we have different numbers of significant genes that are output from this analysis. Whereas if we use containers, we can at least isolate that as a variable, and we know we can be more consistent about what our results are. It doesn't mean that one results are better than the other, but think back to when we talk about a scenario in which we're adding more data. Let's say our results change. If we have both a varying computer environment and varying data, now we don't know, is it truly because of the data that the results are different, or is it because of the computing environment? And so if we use containers, we can isolate that as a variable, and we can be more sure about our results, at least in the consistency of them. So yes, this is a very good tool for reproducibility. We go more into detail about this in our containers course, but this allows us to share environments without actually shipping laptops in any way. And this is a little bit of a schematic to show how that can kind of happen. So an image is like a snapshot of the computing environment that we can share easily. And then we can build then a container from that image to kind of duplicate that computing environment that snapshot took a snapshot of, okay? So images, they're like a snapshot of an environment that's shareable, whereas containers is a place that you can have an environment to actually do the stuff. So in the containers where we will actually run the analysis. And that can ensure that we get more consistent results across different researchers. So we're going to talk more about containers in the containers course, but for now, this is a very important side note. I just need you to know that if you do decide to kind of play around with some containers and images, it's highly, highly important that you do not put any secured protected data types, so PII, so personally identifiable information, or PHI, personal health information on your Docker images. You do not want to do that, especially if you're sharing them. I guess if you didn't share them, it would be okay, but like as much as possible, you want to put as many layers of safety and security when you're working with protected data. So just no matter what, make sure that if this is you, if you're working with protected data, please do consult your IRB, your security experts before you do anything with containers or images, or really any of your research. You should make sure you're consulting experts on this stuff first. Okay, so summary of the structure then. We talked a little bit about each of these points. We want to know when the GitHub action is going to run, with what is it going to run, and then also what is it actually going to do when it does run. Okay? And that's your fundamentals. That's the basics. And from here, we're gonna learn a little bit more. So have fun running your first GitHub action in the exercise, and we'll talk more about the details later.